Good day, everybody. Dave Walker here with the B2SMB Institute. And over the last year, um, we have really fostered a wonderful relationship with Accenture and have come together around a shared passion in small businesses. Yes, Accenture has a genuine passion for small business, and your speaker today has a particular passion for small business, I will attest. But what we really have evolved to over the course of this last year is really a mission to create a genuine center of excellence inside of the Institute that is really co-owned and co-operated by this huge number of subject matter experts that live inside the Accenture ecosystem. And I think that you'll see in this conference, we've actually brought forward 4 presentations from different subject matter experts inside of Accenture that really kind of cover a gamut of a number of the challenges that you all have told me are the challenges that you believe you're facing in 2022. But in their very first one that we're going to do on Wednesday morning, that we'll release on Wednesday morning, is with Stephanie Gorski, who's a managing director at Accenture. Good morning, or good afternoon, or whatever the hell time of day it is, Stephanie.
Good morning and good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here, Dave.
It's always a pleasure to have you. And this one is the one that I always just love, kind of almost sitting back and letting it kind of just wash over me. It's the incredible amount of research that you guys do as a company, but specifically, this is research that you've done for quite some time, really on the state of small business globally. Before we kind of dive into it, do you want to just give a little bit of a brief background on you? I'm not going to assume everybody knows who you are, even though you've presented a couple of times to this audience. But a little brief background on you, the practice that you run at Accenture, and really a little bit of background on this research, and then we'll dive right into it.
Absolutely, and I'm happy to. So it's a pleasure to be with everyone. So as Dave mentioned, Stephanie Gorski, I'm a managing director focused on SMBs. So I'm a global lead for small and medium-sized businesses. And the reason why we focus on SMBs, as Dave mentioned, it's a little interesting from Accenture's lens, is because many of our enterprise clients, it's a big portion of their business. So I focus on our software and platform players and supporting them effectively on how they work and support small, medium-sized businesses in their environment. So I've had a passion for this area and really figuring out how to bridge the gap between, which you're going to hear me talk about quite a bit today, between enterprises and SMBs over the last 4 or 5 plus years. And then for me personally, my dad is a small business. He's runs his own rare book company. And so I see firsthand, and I'm going to talk about digital maturity and understanding today. I see this happening firsthand in my daily life. And I get questions and calls all the time on how best to run his business. So it's fun for me to merge what I do in my personal life and also what I focus on for Accenture quite heavily.
That's terrific. So without further ado, why don't you take us through this research that I think is so important and gives so much to our audience?
I would love to. So can you see the screen?
Sure can. We're good.
Awesome. Rock and roll. So for today, and this is truly an excerpt. So Dave, you mentioned we've done a ton of research and analysis for small, medium-sized businesses, both in the US, globally, in specific areas of Europe. And I have a wealth of, it was fun actually trying to pull some greatest hits for today of things to talk about and things to land on, because there's so much material behind this. So I'm going to hit on a few pieces. And what I would like to call this today is a little bit of interesting insights to noodle over. And Dave mentioned already that we're having a couple different conversations as Accenture with Dave this week. And so part of it's also teeing up some of those conversations and why we think they're so critical and so important. So for today, let's land on how big, and I hope many of you who are part of this understand the SMB imperative and how critical it is based on COVID and everything that's going on in the environment today and how fast things are changing, that really it's a critical time for enterprise companies to really effectively support SMBs. And what we're seeing, and you're going to hear me talk about so much today, is that many enterprise companies still aren't meeting SMB expectations. And we're doing this pulse study and research all the time, but there's truly a disconnect and a way to improve the understanding of what SMBs need. And Dave, you've heard me say this many a times, but based on all the conversations I've had, and many of this is based on the quantitative research, but I have tons of qualitative types of interviews and discussions with SMBs. There's two basic things that continue to stick with me. One of them is small and medium-sized businesses feel like the lost in between consumer and enterprise companies. Most of the products that many of our enterprise companies make are either for other enterprises or consumers. And usually SMBs feel like one has been recrafted to fit their needs and really isn't listening to them as a specific audience and developing the product for them. The other piece that I'm very focused on today has been, as I think about it, I support I mentioned a lot of our enterprise clients as Accenture. When I recommend B2B selling for an enterprise selling to an enterprise, at no point in time do I recommend them looking at the whole enterprise audience and selling the exact same way. So one of the pieces that we're going to talk about in our segmentation discussion later is why in the world does anyone think they can sell to the whole SMB audience in the exact same way? So it's super interesting when we start diving into this deeper, that there's really broad brushstrokes taken by enterprises right now on how they address SMBs, and SMBs are just fundamentally different across the board. So you're going to hear me talk about three specific areas to cover today. One, understand the SMB. So really understand segmentation intelligently, not one segmentation model, and how we start thinking about a sophisticated approach. The message I've been continually hitting with you, Dave, is around earn SMB trust. Trust leads to so much value for an SMB when we create that around the SMB enterprise relationship. They are willing to spend more when they trust the enterprise. And you'll hear me, some of that I've already shared with you, so I'll recap some of that today and make sure that that's really a part of the message because it's so critical to the path forward. And then finally, relationship. So much of this model hinges on building relationships. No one wants a transactional conversation anymore. It's about developing personalized ways to connect with SMBs and make sure you're focusing on their individual customer journey and truly embedded in their success. And it's amazing to see. One of the pieces that I'm so excited about is we see a big willingness to pay difference. And when SMBs feel like they have a trusted relationship and a relationship that is truly that they feel like the enterprise is there to support them instead of just earn their business. All right.
I'll interject to say that it's interesting that these three topics or these three approaches are enormously reflected in the interviews that we've done with the best to SMB brand nominees. So of those 9 interviews that we did with very senior level C-suite execs from each of those enterprises that was nominated in one of 4 categories, it's interesting how when they reflect on their success, why were they nominated in the first place? These are the 3 things that they recognize themselves are absolutely critical to their offering and to their success.
I love hearing that. It feels like everything's triangulating around these two. So that's fantastic. So just to ground everyone, we're saying that things have grown and changed over the last year from how much we've done in the research lens. This is a much bigger slide than Dave, you saw a year ago. Mm-hmm. We really launched so many different surveys, and I have a number in market right now, around 8,000 different SMB respondents that we're capturing in this material and 11 markets to really understand how SMBs and enterprises look at things differently. I have a lot of global material, but we're going to focus heavily on US today, but I'm going to highlight some of those key differences that we see throughout. And one of the reasons why we have focused on these global markets is because they're really representative of some of the different activities that are happening specifically at SMBs. Now, coolest thing that you're going to hear me talk about is there are definitely differences between these markets, and I don't go into too much detail on that. For example, Japan operates for SMBs very differently. They operate very differently than the rest of the world. However, there's a lot of similarities too. It was actually amazing to see the digital maturity levels across the board. And that's what I'm going to highlight today, and some of the different preference points of how they want to be proactively engaged with. So I'm excited to share that. So if we jump in, I've landed every conversation, Dave, with you around digital maturity. And when we land on digital maturity, the reason why this is always a guiding factor for me when I'm starting to do analysis is when we talk about what's happened with COVID, everyone continually talks, and I continue to say this, around we've seen more digital transformation than ever before. The piece that we continue to forget is usage does not equal adoption, does not equal understanding, does not equal comfort level with some of these products. And what I continue to hear from all the SMBs we're interviewing, also surveying, is that really, even though they're moving to these online platforms and pieces of business function, they're not really feeling comfortable with it yet. They don't feel like they're adopting in a way that's effective. It's not fully integrated into their business. And really, they don't feel like they're using it to the whole breadth and depth that it can be used for. So when we asked about online and offline mix and comfort level, whenever we look at these, and we've done digital maturity the exact same way over the course of many different pieces of analysis, we continue to see this breakdown. It's kind of amazing. We're seeing it at a global level now too. Breakdown of, there's a small savvy portion, there's still a straggler portion that's mostly offline, and then there's a huge chunk of companies that are in that emerging bucket. And the emerging bucket, when I think of those are the SMBs that are starting to move the direction towards savvy, but don't feel like they have the support, engagement, understanding, the training to get there. And I show these arrows on the right-hand side around age and size continuously, no matter when we run this. The younger SMBs are flowing to the top. Now, it's not a huge difference. It's not always the younger SMBs at the top, but normally on average, younger SMBs fit in that savvy category. They're born out of a digital age. They're moving that direction. And it's also the bigger ones, the ones that can have that digital transformation, pay for that work, make sure they have an organization or an area of their organization focused on actually being digitally savvy. So, and then at the bottom, it's the smaller and the older. So if we break this down, though, we'll talk about this later this week around segmentation, these are not the ways, though, that I would segment SMBs. I don't see a lot of similarities, like I just mentioned. There's not a huge difference in age. There's not a huge difference in what size they are, but there's a huge difference in how those that are digitally mature operate and those that are in the emerging savvy and the straggler category. Dave,
when you talk to and present this to some of your large B2SMB brand clients, do they nod their head and say, yeah, that's what it about feels like from our customer base? Or do they say, particularly in the platforms that you guys work with, do they say, no, pretty much all of our users are up in that savvy category? You know, there's kind of that self-confidence that, yeah, they're the cream of the cream. Or do they really recognize that this is kind of, in the world of however many millions of small businesses there are, this is kind of how the pie is shaped?
They are seeing this as the pie. Nobody has pushed back on this conversation around how this pie is shaped. However, so the two conversations I'm having a lot is, how do we move from the emerging into the savvy, right? That's one piece. And then the other piece of the pie is that savvy bucket is really over-penetrated. So when we talk to many of our enterprise clients, they're saying, I'm spending most of my time focused on the savvy bucket. And many of us are saying, okay, why? Great, everyone is. So in order to make sure you're getting more of the share and the scale and the engagement model with the SMBs, you got to start looking at the emerging and the stragglers, and really figuring out, how do you work with them differently? And this goes back to the beginning of our conversation, right? Around how they're retooling enterprise products or services. Well, guess what? Those work more effectively for the savvy. No wonder you're spending more time with the savvy bucket, because they're the ones that get it like that.
Right.
So it's the harder move to spend time with the emerging and stragglers. And that's been a big click too for many of the conversations. It is more of a like, okay, I get that's a harder bucket. No wonder they're still sitting there. And then you and I have talked about this, and every survey I've done shown this. Those buckets really aren't changing that mix. They might change 2% or 3%, up or down in certain directions, but nobody's making major moves to turn that 49% into 30.
Yeah, and as much as was written in this last year about, quote, the digital transformation of small business that was in some ways forced upon them by the pandemic, your data really suggests not so much.
Yeah, well, and the word that you just used is forced. So forced does not mean adoption, does not mean true understanding, does not mean comfort, doesn't mean they're going to not revert back to the way they were before. I mean, I mentioned my father, who did get forced into being more digitally online, not digitally savvy though. And then at the same time too, had, you know, in-person events this past weekend. It was kind of like, I'm never going back to online. So it's really a discussion that's continually, I think one of the things that we're missing when we talk about enterprises too, working with these SMBs, is continuing to show value.
Right.
When we talk about like that return on investment, that value story, that continual value proposition is critical to feeling comfortable, and also that relationship piece. That's why it's so important to build that throughout the value chain for SMBs, which actually fits perfectly with the next slide. So I want to ground a little bit on the engagement journey, because I'm going to touch on different pieces of the engagement journey. So when we start thinking about an SMB engagement model with an enterprise company, and I would almost like to create this into a real circle, but I'm just keeping it linear today for ease of use. Self-discovery, company outreach. I'm going to talk a little bit about proactive and letting SMBs do their own self-discovery when they're identifying products and services. Evaluation factors they use, what's their purchase journey, how do they think about self-service and human-led support, what's that support model, and then reevaluation. So when I talk about reevaluation, which I'm not going to go into in this specific slide today, but Dave, what you just mentioned is so critical to that relationship model that they're thinking about, and why it's so important to have a relationship with SMBs. Is that reevaluation is constantly happening. And if you don't stay top of mind and someone that they look at, like an enterprise company that they go to for their needs, you're going to have it happen a lot more frequently than you think. So it's critical as you take an SMB through this whole journey and you work with them, that you don't forget that after purchase, there's a whole nother part of the journey that matters. That support and reevaluation is just as critical as helping them through the discovery and purchase phase. So with that being,
I don't know if I'm stealing thunder from a later slide, but what's the impact of peers, small business peers, on kind of each of these stages of engagement?
I love that you said that, and you are stealing a little bit of thunder, but I think it's
sorry.
No, you're totally fine. I love that you're asking it. It's critical. 80% of SMBs told us that they see higher revenue and higher impact on their bottom line when they work with peers. I'm going to touch a little bit on the self-discovery and that piece of it and how critical they are at that phase. But absolutely, they feel like end to end, if they're interacting with another SMB, they are more effective in their work, their environment, and also how they go about their day-to-day business and their end revenue.
Yeah, and I think that this is a terrific map of kind of the journey that small businesses are on, and I wouldn't dispute any of it. And I bring up peers because I actually think, to the negative, they could negatively impact any number of these things. So if in the discovery process, a peer talks to a peer, a small business talks to a peer and says, yeah, it's the worst product in the world. The rest of it, we could work your butt off, but the rest of it's not going to happen. And then equally, you know, I think some companies are finding that the best kind of support network that they can offer, particularly in the form of self-service, is peer-to-peer, is let peer users teach the newbies how to actually get the most out of a product, versus trying to have even trained professionals do it, because the peers kind of always present it in the form of shortcuts very effectively, and it works so well. So interesting.
I love that you said that, because it's from a lens that really resonates. And the statement that I would say, if there's one gap that I completely agree with you, another SMB can deteriorate this when they work peer-to-peer, but at the same time too, many of these enterprise companies that I work with, right, you have a range of SMBs that you're already spending time with, that are already engaging with your product and your service. Harness that community. Harness it in a way that doesn't feel like a sales effort or a support effort, but in a true organic fashion, and be a collaborator, an organizer, an orchestrator. That'll go a long way. That'll be truly critical. So I love that you jumped there. So let's keep going, because we're going to get there. So I'm going to highlight, there's a few different pieces, and I'm going to highlight going through that flow, things that were interesting. And there are tons that's interesting. So this is just fun because we only have, not a full, the full day to talk about this together, Dave, which you and I could. But in discovery, the interesting thing that's continually captivating around discovery is understanding what SMBs want, but also how they operate. And some of those it's not always the same. So what I'm highlighting on this is when we talk to SMBs, and we, in the last survey, really analyzed this through a global lens, 15% of SMBs preferred proactive outreach. And what I mean by proactive outreach is emailing, calling, scheduling calls, reaching out proactively, even knocking on the door and saying, I think I have an opportunity or a product or service that would meet your needs. So not that many, right? 15% is not that high. But when we asked how many products or services did you buy recently because of proactive outreach, salesperson contacted you, figured out what you needed. 44% recently purchased a product or service. Now, when we asked enterprises, how many of you have proactive outreach? Really an outbound selling team that focuses specifically on SMBs. Only 23% said they had a team actually focused on selling directly to SMBs. So when you think about that, and we think about keep grounding on where's the opportunity for enterprises to do something different because of what SMBs are, how SMBs are acting, what they need. Outbound selling is one of those key pieces, and really identifying true SMB needs in a personalized way that could uniquely change really how enterprises work with or go to market with it for SMBs. Now, the chart in the middle, the piece that I really want to highlight here, and so many of the enterprise clients I work with, I keep harping on how important this is. Search engines and company websites. Every time, and again, this is global, but every time I launch this, these are the number one things in addition to word of mouth, which you'll see as the most important for US, not necessarily globally. And word of mouth is, by the way, the peer-to-peer that you just talked about, Dave. But having a search engine and capability, saying in a search engine, hey, what do I need, SMB of 10 people, what do I need to run my business, is a common search when you're starting to think about how you get up and running, or what's the best cell phone plan for my small business, or how do I actually, make sure I'm effectively advertising, what are the top platforms that I should use. All of those are used when they're first self-discovering pieces. So when an enterprise doesn't have really the search capabilities aligned to those core questions, those simple questions, it's critical. And then also company website. So many companies nowadays, again, what I was talking about before, don't necessarily have a specific SMB landing page within their products or their services, which is quite amazing because you need to be telling the small and medium-sized business message separate from everything else. And this goes to solution-based selling versus just product-based selling or service-based selling. What are really SMB needs, challenges that your product can address, and how does it do that? So being truly tailored to both of those, I would say, are step one before you even, and you don't even see it on here. So many people I work with are like, okay, what can I do in social advertising for SMBs? Well, guess what? That shouldn't be priority number one. Get the basics right. Really make sure that you have a company website that addresses SMB needs.
So I have a question here because I think that this is actually a pretty provocative screen to the right and to the left and in the middle even. There was research, there was data out there for quite some time that showed an increasing percentage of small businesses making a purchase decision before they ever actually talked to a sales representative. This would suggest that is diminished, but as importantly, it suggests that they actually like it when they're talking to a sales representative. And it does help. At least 44% of them are recognizing that, yeah, this actually was what caused me to purchase, was a sales representative have contacted me and was working with me. Is it time for, I think what you're suggesting, hey, it's time to reconsider your outbound selling approach to small business? And is it go as far as to say it's time for you to reconsider cold calling small business, or is it time to reconsider creating more of an inbound funnel than professional salespeople can handle? How does it tactically manifest, do you think?
I think it's a combination of both, honestly. None of this lasts very well on its own, right? So even cold calling we're seeing today, and one of the pieces you'll see me talk about in a second is email's actually the preferred channel. But you don't just email alone. You do email, follow up with a schedule, like give a scheduled option, also give them access to material. Just be proactive and provocative around it. Because Dave, you know this, we've been talking about this forever. One thing that's common within SMBs is everyone's time poor right now. So one of the reasons why proactive selling is working, not necessarily to 15%, it's not a preferred excited route, but why it's working is partly because of time poor. When you're top of mind and you're showing a value prop to SMBs, they're purchasing, and they're actually purchasing products and services. But if you're coming with a message that doesn't work and isn't resonating and isn't personalized, that purchase is not going to happen. So I think it's a combination of both that outbound selling, inbound option, but also doing it through a multitude of different channels. Giving the option of chat is another piece, right? When I'm starting to inquire about something, let's give the option of chat. So it's not just getting outbound right, it's getting search engines, company website, chat options, all those different pieces all right together and working cohesively. All right, I'm going to keep going. So evaluation and purchase decision. So we continue to see that pricing is an important factor across the board. And now you've seen the split. Where we're splitting on this slide is around the stragglers, the emerging, and the savvy SMBs. Again, this is at a global level. So the way to look at this is the top chart is the top SMB evaluation factors. When we get down to truly evaluating which item do we purchase if we're comparing, here's the top evaluation factors. And then the top purchase channels of like, where are they actually going to purchase? Now we can break this down many perspectives around what type of product they're purchasing or service they're purchasing, but this is a roll up. What continues to be important is price. And when I say price, it's not only that like actual end dollar amount, it's truly that value prop, that ROI, the understanding how it all flows through and when to expect a return on investment. The next piece is product fit. That is truly a product that is made for SMBs. And then ease of use. Simple button. We just told time poor, but it's the simple button. How do I actually do that? And then obviously very close to ease of setup. Onboarding and enablement. I cannot tell you how much I've heard in the last 3 to 6 months, how awful some onboarding experiences are. I mean, I interviewed an SMB the other week and they said I wouldn't put anyone through that product onboarding experience again. And if I had to do it again, I probably wouldn't have picked the same product. So that ease of setup, that flow of enablement, that managing to the criteria for an SMB of like it being time effective, seeing my return on investment is critical as you start talking about this. When I go take these evaluation factors and I think about it to your point on the last point on like, do we start seeing some outbound selling? These are the factors I would hit when talking to an SMB. I would have a discussion around why are we price effective and what value can you see from my product and what return on investment you're going to see? Why is this fit specifically for you, SMB, within what industry, within what size, digital maturity level, ease of use? Why is this so easy and simple? And where's the simple setup and onboarding? And then at the bottom, I keep coming back to, I'm obsessed with obviously company website because of how much it's talked about here, but company website. Still see the importance of in-store, and this ranking is being done during COVID too. So there's still a value of in-store and salesperson, as well as online marketplace. And you do see a difference. The interesting factor, and it's always something I'm going to come back to around how much do you focus on increasing the digital maturity of your SMBs? Absolutely critical because you start seeing the mix of what they care about change. Price becomes a lesser factor as you start seeing companies become more savvy. Same thing, in-store becomes a lesser factor as you see companies becoming more savvy. So does salesperson, whereas online marketplace goes up. Stuff that's easier to scale with becomes more critical to SMBs when they become more savvy. So putting the investment as an enterprise into increasing digital maturity changes the mix of how you interact, which gives more opportunity to scale around SMBs.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so then support. So we jumped from taking on the journey of discovery and then price and evaluation, and now I'm taking you to support. So with support, we talked about how much they value price affordability. Support is another second piece. So we asked the SMBs or what enterprises can do to win more of their business, and support was one of the top pieces. So the last one we showed, what are they doing when they evaluate the actual purchase? This is more taking a step back and like, what can you do overall? And better customer support continues to come up. Now, what we did this time, and you've heard me say this one before, what we did this time is we actually asked SMBs, are they willing to pay more for support? And 53% agreed that they pay extra to get better customer support.
Mm-hmm.
However, when we look at this and we look at customer support, only 46% of enterprises have a centralized team that focuses on supporting SMBs. And they're not even doing day-to-day support. Like they're not, those are SMB strategies, different pieces of how to interact. When you think about customer support, this doesn't have to be just only human one-on-one engagement models. This can be through a portal. This can be through, email follow-ups or proactive engagement. But getting something that feels more personalized, more focused on the SMB, SMBs are willing to pay for, which I thought was one of the coolest things out of this research that was absolutely critical.
And again, reflected in some of the conversations from our Best SMB Award nominees is this notion that you cannot look at support and after the sales service as an expense. You have to actually look at it as an investment that successfully supports your ongoing sales effort. Because if you really, whether it's an additional sale to the same customer, or whether it's the word of mouth of that customer, that disgruntled customer who said, I didn't really get supported and I never put anyone else through this, again, that's really the investment behind what, for a lot of organizations I know, think of this as an expense. And why do we have to do it? All it does is eat away at our bottom line. So I think it's an important insight into really, particularly what SMBs seem to require.
Dave, I could not agree more. And you'll notice when I outline the flow on the first page or the second page, I never said sales in it. Mm-hmm. And the reason why is exactly what you just said. It's an ongoing sales experience based on how SMBs interact with each other, based on how SMBs purchase to. Once you gain their trust and develop a relationship with them, that number, and you'll hear me say in a second, they're willing to spend more of their actual money with you, 5 to 15% more. So when you embed that and continue to build that relationship through support, through a good onboarding experience, through great enablement, you're making a lasting partner in this process. Mm-hmm. So I love that. So let's keep going forward. So then we asked SMBs, what do you want? Ways enterprises can improve customer support for SMBs. So overall, you'll see this is also, I'm continuing to send the message that digital maturity and focusing on improving digital maturity for SMBs matters because it changes the mix. So you'll see the stragglers, the most digitally immature, want to speak to a real person. Now that goes down for those that are more savvy. Now, if we talk about the rest, reduce wait times, understand my business more, understand my industry more, talk so much lately when I talk to support communities for SMBs around how critical it is to start creating pods of people that really, when you're engaging with an SMB, that aren't just focused on all the array of SMBs, but maybe focus on one industry. So they have deep knowledge in that industry and can relate specifically to that SMB. So having more of a segmented support model, absolutely critical. Training agents to solve all my needs. We hear a lot just about understanding in all these different pieces. Giving my business a dedicated agent. I'm actually really surprised. If you see where that is, it's all the way at the end of the third from the right, or my right, when you're looking at this, it's amazing that's so far down. SMBs are really just saying up front that they want to feel like they're connected, having a relationship. That's why they're saying real person, but then also they just want you to understand who they are and what they're doing and really personalize customer support in a tailored way. I do like, though, at the end, you see how high actually support through other channels, which we just talked about, is more of those savvy. So as you're evolving the savvy mix within your SMBs, social media, SMS, messaging apps, critical to have that multitude of different channels to engage and support. Awesome. So I'm going to keep going. So then finally, this is end-to-end engagement. This is not just support. And Dave, you hit on this a little bit earlier. So we are still breaking down on the digital maturity scale. But when we do proactive outreach and kind of the engagement model, email always rises to the top. Now, people ask, enterprises talk to me all the time about, yeah, but my click-through rate on email is awful. How do I actually make sure that that's a better engagement model? It's about persistence. I hate saying it that way. You're not going to necessarily get the click-through rate you want all the time from an email perspective. And you and I, Dave, have talked very frequently about how much SMBs are flooded with many different avenues of outreach, not whether it be just enterprises, but also others that are trying to engage with them, and how many different training sessions or webinars and everything else they have. This is about being persistent across many different channels. So if we look at the stragglers, the emerging and the savvy, what we continue to see is email matters, in-person matters, and it's a combination of both. Now, I just mentioned social direct messaging, and that social aspect of things is coming up to start being big for emerging and savvy, and learning how to use new channels, engage SMBs with where they're at and where they are on their journey is critical. So it's fun to see starting to test out some of that social media direct messaging piece of things.
This is a really fascinating slide. I mean, because it is such a, as you mentioned earlier, there's segments within segments within segments when it comes to small business. But this from a channel of communications perspective is absolutely critical to have nailed down. And do you believe that eventually you'll start to really flesh out, well, what is the messaging behind the channel for each of these?
Yeah, absolutely. What message works at what time? So, I mean, I laid out a pretty rudimentary journey, right? At what time in the journey of a lifespan of SMB do they use different types of aspects of this, and like what will hit them the best? What wording, what type of look? That all comes with time and enough exposure. And that's been some of the things I've been doubling down on. So I'm happy you even mentioned that. Don't have anything yet for you on that, but I will get there.
All right. To-do list.
So yeah, it's on my to-do list. So you mentioned peer earlier, and I'm so happy you did. So we're going to dive into a little bit. We just talked about end-to-end engagement. So now let's talk about peer engagement. And I hit on word of mouth being so critical for the US. So I hit this earlier, 80% of SMBs responded that they agree or strongly agree that engaging with a peer is extremely valuable to my business. Can't dispute that. That number is so huge. And it goes across almost a number of different ways to segment this. It's really critical when we look at this, the newer SMBs, the larger SMBs, and the more savvy SMBs. Well, it kind of equates to what we just said in the last one. You see those categories aligning pretty well and closely. They all find that sentiment even more important than some of the other breakdowns, which I find interesting. So if you talk about savvy, let's just hit that briefly, right? Those are the ones that are more comfortable with the products and tools that are being put out there, but still see the value of engaging with other SMBs, which I feel is awesome to see. Start telling that story, having those SMBs tell a story to others in the straggler or the emerging community that you're targeting as an enterprise, saying why this is so critical and what's been so helpful of them engaging with other SMBs. It's a pretty interesting story to tell. So leveraging these populations that have found extreme value in that the peer-on-peer engagement model could be quite critical as you continue to see growing these other areas or segments of SMBs within your product or service business. Awesome. I'm going to keep going. So then I love this one. So this is probably one of my favorite slides that we've developed. And the reason, it's got so much on it, but the reason is we asked SMBs, what peer set do you find most valuable? And by the way, this is them telling us versus us segmenting and looking through regression models and correlations of how they actually interact with each other. So there's a difference. For example, we don't see SMBs within the same industry operating very similarly and or asking for the same type of stuff. When we look at it from a model of, okay, how should you segment your SMB population because they operate similarly, we don't see that as being the important factor. However, when you're talking to an SMB and you're trying to connect them to other SMBs or you're creating community, that was the #1 factor, was actually that they were in the same industry. They find a comfort within a peer-to-peer model of being in the same industry. The next one I was really excited about too, facing similar challenges. So I just hit, naturally, Dave, we were just talking about of knowing where an SMB is on their journey of what are they facing, what are they addressing, how are they kind of going through things. Maybe they're transitioning to build from a team of 2 to 10. Can I talk to other SMBs that have done that before or at that same state so I can kind of commiserate and figure it out together? That's critical to an SMB too. And then sell similar products or services or similar company side and some revenue. Those were all the factors. Now, the only ones that are different on that, you can see Savvy has a couple boxes that aren't aligned with the rest on the right-hand side. The Savvy wants to say similar choices around digital tools and products. And they also want to have similar digital skills. I find this compelling. So those that are digitally savvy recognize the criticality of having an SMB that understands where they are in their digital journey and understanding what type of tools they use to know how to work with each other. So there's a little bit of different communities that you need to build depending on where you're at, where the SMBs you're working with or that are your customers and how they're engaging.
It makes perfect sense. Some of the numbers that I'll just highlight that stick out to me is that for the established businesses, in many cases, facing similar challenges is actually a higher index than in the same industry. There's a recognition that, I need that person who is at the right moment facing a shipping and logistics crisis versus somebody who's exactly in the same kind of manufacturing business as I'm in. So I think that in and of itself is interesting and obviously very, very helpful. And I think the team at Alignable would back this up, who are now rolling out entire communities within communities of small businesses. Their groups are really aggregating around categories, certainly, but they're also aggregating around stage, around what stage of business are they? Are they early? Are they, are they nascent? Are they mature? And by association, based on what stage they're at, are they at the stage where they need financing? Are they at the stage that they need a good payroll system? They can't just write checks in the back room anymore. That those are things that really kind of draw small businesses together in their 6.5 million small business users. Interesting.
I love hearing that. That's awesome. So then the final piece, and you asked me a little bit about that journey up front, how does peer play a role when we first started? So we're only going to look at the pre-purchase stage of that discovery. But which resources do you trust the most at which stage in the purchase journey, excuse me. And then we're going to hit, actually, we do have a little bit of support in here. So at that discovery and purchase phase, self-guided matters, right? And we heard that in the other slide, self-guided matters. However, when they're reporting themselves, when they make a purchase decision, they're actually saying they use a little bit of that that company representative. What I love seeing here is it's self-guided research plus personal network. So building that personal network and helping SMBs build a personal network, valuable, absolutely valuable, because like you said, they're going to turn to their friend or their fellow SMB, their mentor, their different, the people in their network and say, okay, what do you think of this product? Now, when I'm figuring out best practices and I'm going towards adoption and I've already purchased the product, and I'm doing customizing for my needs and also ongoing support, I'm turning to a company representative. So your point on it's a money suck kind of situation for enterprises, and I keep saying it's it hurts my bottom line. That's actually the most critical time that you spend your money on. So if you're really going to, simplifying this pretty heavily, as an enterprise where you put your money to make this effective for SMBs and to use to scale and make sure you retain them, I'd spend more money on your actual onboarding, enablement, and support than I would spend up front on the sales journey around, or the what we call the pre-sales journey, or excuse me, pre-purchase journey around discovery and purchase. I would make sure you're enabling that organic community, building word, making people happy in those two other categories, because that's the stuff you can affect and that they're relying on for you as an enterprise company.
Yep.
All right, so with time, I know Dave, we're already have gone way into this. I have all the material that we said before, but I just want to I'm going to run through just to remind people of some critical factors. As I said, we're going to ground on trust again. We talked about this way before. These gaps, same gaps I've shown before, we're still seeing them. We've asked this question numerous times. We're still seeing a gap between trust, caring, understanding, relationship. Now it has moved slightly, and I don't show it in this number, around trust and understanding. Caring and relationship has not moved. Those are the two pieces that, if I have to say where we need really enterprise companies to double down, is understanding what means success for the SMBs they work with, showing caring around that, and then building that strong relationship for continual impact. And I talked about this before, but I just want to remind everyone, and I mentioned it, 5 to 15%, if you build trust, SMBs are willing to spend 5 to 15% more. And I'm going to flip through the next ones, and this is just a regrounding, but we talk about digital maturity so heavily that I just want to make sure everyone, if you haven't listened to the conversations before, that you remember those digital maturity levels are key indicators if an SMB trusts you or not. Those stragglers don't feel like their needs are being met. Thus, 37% trust the enterprises they work with. The savvy do. So everything we've been talking today is summed up in kind of how we start looking at the differences between maturity levels. All right, so what other trends? And Dave, I'm happy to talk further about any questions and anything else, but I'm really excited for the conversations that are continuing to happen with Accenture, but there's a few trends I want to hit too. So one of the pieces that I'm super excited about, and we won't have time to hit it, but it may be a future discussion around low code, no code. And this is a big deal from a technology lens of how we're seeing SMBs finally get an opportunity to wield the technology and make it customized for them without really a ton of digital capabilities. So I'm pushing pretty heavily in discussions with a number of enterprise clients around how critical it is to enable your product with have a low code, no code type product that SMBs can really tailor to make their own. I spent time with a company recently, and they said it gave them the speed and the capability, and it was a startup SMB, to really move quickly and also not have necessarily the tech talent that they expected on the ground, and use people that, quite frankly, were best athletes, lack of a better term, to make their product successful and experiment quickly. The next piece is around segmentation. I know we're talking about this too here shortly together with another one of my colleagues, but this is so critical and can't be overlooked. The segment, and it's also not hard. You do not have to have a complex segmentation model when it comes to SMBs, but one of the key pieces around this is it's really hard for me to continue to hear that SMBs, how we define SMBs by some enterprises is based on how much revenue or how much spend they have with a specific company. And it's super hard to hear when Accenture is labeled an SMB. So I think this is something that I'm excited for us to spend more time on. And then finally, this goes back to the last pieces I was going through. Community is critical. I mean, if there's one takeaway from everything that you and I were just back and forth on, is around how much that cycle of engaging with SMBs, that support area, is so critical. And it doesn't mean it has to be just one-on-one support. It's how SMBs support each other. It's how enterprise companies show up for support. It's how you think about proactively, consistently engaging with SMBs that makes a huge difference.
Well, I think these things in conclusion, I think these three things is a jumping off point for what really our partnership in creating a real center of excellence. These are the three topics that really, I think, drive 2022. And I think each of them in their own way has, um, I think low code, no code, there's still a real gap in understanding of what exactly that means. It's a little bit like we're caught in the flywheel of trying to understand what AI and machine learning is. It's just, I think figuring out how we can all engage in that conversation, what it exactly means for the products that we're delivering to small business is critical.
100%.
Segmentation feels like it feels like a throwback almost of gosh, have we not gotten this right yet? I mean, we've been working on segmentation in this arguably highly fragmented customer base called small business, but we in many ways still don't appear to be getting it right, particularly as evidenced by the fact that there's too many small businesses who don't believe that we understand them. And that's likely the result of the fact that we're segmenting them wrong and we're not understanding them well. And then this last one, which really does feel new, and I'm not sure, just as your last piece of advice here, does this notion that community is crucial for SMBs, was that made more acute in these last 18 months?
I believe it has. And I believe it's been critical from a perspective of, it's been made more acute, to your point, but I also think it's this trust gap, I think, has highlighted it more. For example, for when SMBs trust each other, there's a little bit of inherent nature there. The reservation around enterprise companies is pretty big, right? Mm-hmm. So when you're making these massive decisions and these massive change moments that they've been pushed into, who do you go to make sure right. that you're feeling like you have someone to rely on? Because quite frankly, I mean, I know even separate from SMBs, we all are feeling the weight of everything that's happened from a change perspective in all of our lives. Mm-hmm. So having people that can support you in the decisions you're making that are hard ones is critical. And what these communities have been built even stronger, and they've been built pretty organically. But at the same time, I mean, I'm just amazed at, for both segmentation and communities, many enterprise clients of mine have so many SMBs that you could build a community and really spend time on it and engage in the right way that feels very positive in the right trajectory. And then for segmentation, to your point, I agree with you. Segmentation is a throwback. It needs to be done differently. But like not understand, this might be being a little harsh, but not understanding SMBs anymore is not an excuse to me. Right. So many of these, the enterprise players, right, have so many SMBs they're working with. Voice of the customer is critical. And I would tell you in that segmentation piece, if you don't have voice of the customer, you're not continuing to really make SMBs a focus or truly winning over business. So I'm a big voice of everything type person.
Couldn't agree more. As always, terrific. I think you've teed up the other 3 sessions that we have throughout Wednesday morning and teed up the work that we hope to be coming back to at our Forward 22 conference in mid-February. And just as always, really, really terrific stuff. Thank you so much, Stephanie.
Oh, you're so welcome. It was my pleasure. And I'm just excited to keep the conversations going.
Thanks.